today. So yeah, we are starting with Powers Gold. Powers Gold label.
Welcome to pre-1970s Irish whiskey box one. Fionnán O'Connor's going to do the tasting.
Who's that fella? Is he participating?
I have no idea. I absolutely love listening to myself back on the television.
Did he have too much powers last night?
He had too much powers
the ghost of
also.
last night.
The the Powers Gold you have. We came across a big, massive bottle. It was about this size. It was like 4.5 litres or something, whatever it was. And we were still a wee bit dubious as to whether or not to use that one. But I've gone for something 1970s, Powers.
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay, so that's what everyone has in their glass. Talk us through it.
Yeah. So yeah, there was that bizarre, what may or may not be a film prop bottle, which was 60s Powers, and this is an interesting place to start with this one instead, because there's a lot of mystery around that period, around where anything is coming from, and this will relate back to the other bottles. And I think there's a lot of mystery around what was in various liquids, and hopefully mystery that can be certainly expelled soon. But it's a great place to begin with the early years of Irish Distillers Limited. The early IDL years where you're pooling resources, you're seeing things change. There's a big switch to blends away from pot still, and then there's the building of New Middleton. And in that liminal space between 1968 and 1975, IDL exists, but Middleton doesn't. And then, we think of IDL as Middleton. Of course, that stock bleeds in.
That's all we think about now.
So it's a strange, changing world, an era of tremendous turbulence. And what the hell is going into anything remains, slightly up there. And when you look at these, especially the facilities, Middleton was set up to make maize grain whiskey. And then they switched to wheat and then switched back to maize. But before then, they were just beginning, 1968 is when Jameson and Powers and Paddy all become blends. It's the big turning year. But a lot of the grain whiskey was essentially just the pot still stuff run through a column. So even the grain has changed, and you wondered, what the hell was anything at one point or the other? And then the blends were seemingly much heavier, because they were still dipping the toe in the water in terms of making blends at all. Some of them, So it is a kind of an odd, what is it moment, and a lot of my own research with the mash bills is talking about when these places were themselves autonomous. But this becomes a kind of a no man's land of, well, is that even, Powers distillate going in there? And we'll talk about that with the next one especially. But there are these smells that become so characteristic about how we think of Irish whiskey, and they really belong to that era. That weird linseed oil is such an Irish distiller's taste, and I mean, Powers is to put it bluntly, my favourite whiskey. Powers Gold label, blend. If I was under financial duress, I would still drink, and I could afford no other whiskey, I would still find the money to cough up for Powers Gold label now and again,
That's interesting. So, stuff all these other brands, like, we're here at Hinch today, so he doesn't want a bottle of Hinch, he wants a bottle of Powers Gold.
Cheapy, dime a dozen Powers Gold label. It's because it was my first, and for a lot of people it was, you revert to a certain primal instinct. But again, so much more so than Jameson. Powers for ages was the domestic favourite in Ireland. It was only in the 2000s that Jameson outsold Powers in Ireland. And there's a reason why. It was that, again, the most hesitant of the three about becoming a blend at all. It was, 70% pot still, 30% grain for most of its history. The blend, it was, Blackbush the same on the malt side, 80% malt content in a blend. These very, very hefty blends. So there's a lot of, again, auction madness around looking for the old pot still Powers, or the old this or the old that, but the blends themselves were essentially pot still. And again, even the grain whiskey that was going into them seemed to be barley based, Yes. So it's an odd, but then when you're talking about young IDL, there's a question, well, was this stuff made of Powers at all, or was it coming out of, Bow Street or whatever, because they become brands, they're being absorbed, and nobody knows. I don't know, but there are, wherever the magic happens, you start getting that weird, like clover smell. First of all, that clover in linseed oil is such an IDL taste. And some of these tastes are vanishing out of Middleton products. You know, now you taste even just like, you know, 90s Powers blends and they taste different, you know. Green Spot has changed an awful lot, but Green Spot used to have something like that again, that linseed oily characteristic.
And you've got the green spot in your second box for another day to talk through.
Well, there's still that, again, like, even though it's a blend, it has all that pot still characteristic in it, and especially that old, like, whatever it was, whether it was distilled in John's Lane or you know, of course, and you know, they were set up not to be, when they built New Middleton, the intention was to try and maintain some sort of consistency, obviously, with the old ones. That the drinks were modelled off, they, you know, didn't become new beverages. But across Powers, there's always been that weird, like, something between like peach and shoe polish. You know, this weird, like, musty, varnishy, back of the shedness mixed with peach, mixed with apricot, kind of fruit with fuzz on it kind of stuff.
I was just going to say that the thing that even visually draws me to that is that fuzziness on the peach.
It's that, peach fuzz kind of, you know, slightly moldy apricot kind of stuff, and it's so good, and it works.
Like, you wouldn't, if you looked at it, you probably wouldn't want to eat. Sometimes it just doesn't look pleasing enough. Yeah.
And it's that mix, the like primal taste for me in when I think of Irish whiskey, despite how diverse the categories become, you know, I find it very difficult to quite let go of that weird cocktail of like slightly resinous, slightly linseed oily, pot still heft, and Powers peach fuzz apricot-y oomph, you know. And again, I find myself returning to it all the time, you know, and it's a classic.
I love the way he just like throws it into his mouth and then tries to talk when he's got it full. We've got a small crowd here today, so I'm going to use some of the people just because I know they're drinking it. Like, what's your thoughts on the Powers? What are you getting from it?
It does remind me of the 27-year-old Redbreast that we, like, I think I said kerosene at one point.
Right. So okay. So for those that can't hear that, so John's sitting down here and he was suggesting that there's a familiarity, or there's a particle in this which gives him a reference point to the 27-year-old Redbreast. And I think he said, is it creosote, did you say there? Kerosene, sorry. Yeah, so that's interesting. And Jason, what about yourself?
I really get the apricot.
You get the apricot, yeah, you get the apricot, yeah.
It tastes like an aged Irish.
It tastes aged, interesting, okay.
Yeah, it's weird, and again, because a lot of Irish distillers, older Redbreasts, you know, classic Redbreast is mod pot and light pot mixed together, and the 21 and 27 are they're subbing in the heavy pot, and you know, of course, the heavy pot would be the closest to what the old distilleries were making, you know. So it's funny because they're not the older Redbreast taste. Not all of those tastes are the maturation; they're also from the distillate, and a lot of that heavier Middleton is more reminiscent of that, again, like weird stale fruit and leather kind of taste, you know. And leather's a big part of it as well. And it's weird because you see leathery as a taste note all the time. Nobody, myself included, I haven't ever ventured to eat leather. Leather is not a flavour, but we don't talk about it.
You've maybe not ate leather, right? But I have definitely licked leather.
Yeah.
Like, I have definitely licked leather. I'm going to say this from the outset. I've licked leather. And I'm not frightened to say it.
No, I believe you have.
You know?
You were on it was a long night last night, you know. Not everyone, I got a bit tipsy myself.
But you know what?
Didn't quite make it down to the leather, but wasn't far off.
But we've
certainly licking concrete.
I thought we've all been there. I thought we've all been there.
But what I was getting at with that is, I think it becomes a flavour note for Redbreast or for Powers, because there is that weird, like, if you took the smell of leather and turned it into a taste, you're getting close to Powers. And there's so many flavours like that in whiskey where we call them taste notes, and we don't even say, you know, like palate notes, leathery, you know, and because we get the only reference we have is the aromatic equivalent, but there is that weird, like, shoe polish. You know, the way I used to describe John's Lane was like, I can get a glimpse of the joy, you know, my cousin's retriever gets picking up a shoe in its mouth. You know, the like closest I will ever feel to like that pleasure of like Chenna the retriever picking up a shoe gleefully and bringing it over. You know, that flavor. That weird like robustness mixed with like something vaguely sweet, you know, less vanilla dependent than other Middleton products. Of course, they're using the refill barrels. Yeah. And of course, the older bottles, they're less vanilla dependent anyway because the wood isn't as active. But between all those things, again, Powers for me, you know, when we talk about, like for instance, when we look at old Redbreast and old Green Spot, we're not really talking about modern Redbreast and Green Spot at all. We're talking about Bow Street whiskey. They should belong to each other, you know. And these whiskies have changed. And Powers for me is the Irish whiskey with the most consistency across time. You know, it has been, not most consistency, I'll put it this way. Old Powers is the easiest to point to and go, right, that's a Powers, that's where Powers has come from, you know. Jameson has obviously changed radically between the old pot still Jameson and the contemporary Jameson. They're wildly different products, you know, whereas Powers, even when they switched to blends, they never really let go. And Middleton have kept that sense of Powers, and it is such a, you know, if you put Powers in a finish, you know, there might be war the next day. You know, there is that sense of what Powers is meant to taste like, you know, and yeah, it's a good jumping off point to look at the older stuff because it's, again,
we have a microphone getting set up for these guys now, which is really interesting. So I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Richard Dankovich is, you know, you were saying how much you just love the Powers. He was saying hopefully not Austin Powers. Definitely a nice musty note, yet a delicate taste. No fizz on the tongue. No fizz on the tongue.
No. Well, the mustiness is definitely there. You know, and again, like mustiness, another note that comes up with a lot of old pot still. And it's funny, there's a few double distilled pot stills being made up here. And I remember drinking David Boyd Armstrong's for the first time. And also down in Glendalough, they were doing a double distilled pot still. I remember trying that. And I was getting that weird something. It was the first time I'd had pot still from one of the new producers that tasted anything like, and particularly, you know, the Powers taste, that weird apricot-y thing. But of course, you know, triple distilled with a very tailsy cut will be bleeding into that concept as well, you know. So there is that mustiness that gets associated. You know, when Middleton was set up, there were the four distillate streams, you know, light, medium, heavy, trad. Trad and heavy over time seem to have been subsumed into the one that, you know, people go on about trad pot, myself included. You see old, well, I say old, I mean like the 80s old references to the four of them. But I think they really have become, you know, or, you know, I know there's different, God knows how many different processes internally within Middleton, but that idea of tailsier distillate in the pot still style still has that weird, like, it reminds me of, and I hate to repeat myself, but I was working on an article at one point about, that began with the description of Powers, but it reminds me of like carpeted pubs. You know, that weird like smell of carpet that hasn't been cleaned in a long time. That retains, pubs don't smell the same anymore because you know the ripping out of the carpets. But you know that weird like mix of like lino and carpeting, those older smells, and again like a lot of that pot still must. It smells a lot like lino, to be honest. You know, but they're gorgeous, and it reminds me.
How's your lino, guys?
But you smell it. It's a weird, and maybe I can't break that idea of like Guinness and Powers in a pub that like the national drink of a damp, cold, unwelcoming climate. You know, cowering in from the weather. Powers is so much the drink of that experience, you know. And again, that smell of must, of lino. These are heartwarming sensations for me, you know. They're nostalgic.
Yeah, it's not depressing.